All right, I'll try to make this shorter. It's about conservation biology. It's the last chapter in both textbooks. And so what this is going to be talking about are the problems that we are facing today with ecosystems and what we might want to do about them or what people are doing about them. And hopefully you might see some kinds of careers that you didn't know existed with conservation biology. Lots of outdoor kind of careers, which could be fun. If that's something you're interested in, being outdoors a lot. There's also a lot of political kind of careers with conservation biology. You need environmental lawyers and things like that. And there's also more data crunching kind of careers with conservation biology. So we can get the kind of data and do the kind of analyses on a very large scale that we need to do in order to be able to convince people that don't understand science that these are issues, and to also better understand so we can make a better judgment of intervention strategies and what might work. So really what we're talking about here is the loss of biodiversity, meaning variety of life in an environment. That variety of life has 3 levels. So there's diversity in the ecosystem, there's diversity in the species, and there's diversity genetically. And we'll see these 3 levels here. So ecosystem diversity is really referring to all the different organisms in the ecosystem and ecosystem to ecosystem. So I guess here there's one side of the river and the other, so there are interactions between the 2 ecosystems. Let's just pretend they're separate ones. And so that kind of diversity is going to play a role in how they interact with one another. You go within one ecosystem and you have many species. You can see here there's plants and fungus and animals, and there's also protists and bacteria that we don't see. Those are all interacting with one another, and the diversity there is important for balance and the kind of trophic structures and whatnot, the feeding groups and predation groups and prey and herbivory and all that stuff come into play. And then within a species, there is genetic diversity. You can see obviously different alleles in these 3 mouse representations. And so that kind of diversity is going to be important for a population, of course, because without variety, organisms, or I should say populations, can't adapt to changing environments because there's nothing to select for. Unfortunately, lots of organisms are threatened, near threatened, extinct. Endangered is in between extinct and threatened. I don't know why they don't really have that on here, but you can see threatened is almost endangered. Near threatened is we're worried about them, but they're not to dire numbers yet. And lowest risk means they seem to be okay. So you look here, and amphibians have lots of threatened organisms. We've seen that with the fungus really infecting them. But fish, freshwater fish, are also percentage of the fish is very high. You can see numbers-wise, even though it's a smaller percentage, birds have the biggest number total, which means that their percentage is the largest number. But percentage-wise, fish are really in trouble, and you can see the amount of extinctions in fish has been a pretty high percentage of all the ones they're looking at. And that's, water is being disturbed kind of in more extreme ways than land sometimes. And that would probably, that obviously would lead to fish extinction and decline of populations. So as we've talked about most of the semester, community networks, interactions in the ecosystem, between ecosystems, all that stuff means that if you lose one species, even if it's not a keystone species, you can still have drastic impacts on the rest of the environment or the ecosystem. So when we lose genetic diversity, let's say potentially like a whole local population is lost. So there's 4 populations of red squirrels. They obviously are going to have different gene pool distributions because they're sort of in they're different environments to some degree. And let's say you lose an entire pool of those red squirrels, to that population becomes extinct, and whatever alleles they were carrying that weren't in the other populations, they're completely lost. Also, obviously, if you lose that population, you have many less individuals than before. Frequently, these kinds of the loss of biodiversity is obviously human induced. Kind of daily activities that we do or use the products of are making a big impact on other organisms. So agriculture takes a lot of land, a lot of water, lots of fertilizer, all these kinds of things that when they are taken away or put into the environment really change the dynamics. Urban development, clearly taking away land from other organisms and changing the ecosystem entirely by putting buildings there. Forestry, using that for lumber or paper or other kinds of products from trees. So cutting down massive amounts of forest, and sometimes it's really clearing forest for urban development as well. Mining, particularly strip mining, is really devastating, and environmental pollution. So changing the levels of different molecules in the atmosphere and in the water and on the land is going to really change how organisms can interact with that. So here's an example of clearing. This is the clearing of a forest. I don't know what they're going to build here. I can't remember, but you can really see the drastic difference. And they basically just come in and cut the whole thing down. Now, of course, it would be naive to suggest that we just stop all of these kinds of activities, right? Because they're necessary for humans to exist and have a high standard of living, which we enjoy in the United States. So I think, this is personal opinion, but I think that people who say let's just get rid of everything are being unrealistic, and that's not going to really be helpful to solve the problem. On the other hand, groups or people that don't want to change anything and just do whatever humans want to do without thinking about consequences, personally, I also think that that's a problem because there are limited resources. And we are part of the fabric of the biosphere. And so when we change things, it does ultimately impact us. Even if we don't care about any other organisms. I mean, even if we only care about humans, it trickles down, if you will. So I think that it's really about modifying these practices in ways that are sustainable, meaning can be done over the long term with less impact to the environment, but still enough for people to have the kind of lives that they'd like, or at least ones where they're, comfortable, I suppose. We've already talked about invasive species, so that's habitat. Okay, so habitat destruction, you want to know these. Habitat loss is the biggest problem for losing biodiversity. Invasive species are the second biggest problem for losing biodiversity. You see, there's competing, preying on, or parasitizing. And I talk about this in a different lecture, I guess the one about population ecology. So there's that brown tree snake in Guam, major invasive species, has really changed the whole ecosystem there. The third major problem for loss of biodiversity is overexploitation. So that basically means cutting down or fishing or killing too many of an organism too fast. So you can see this in lots of extinct now or really endangered species, right? A lot of them, like the rhinoceroses, were going to be valuable for their horns, and so people killed them in droves in order to get those horns, and now they don't have very many high numbers. Whales were killed for their blubber for a long time, and once it became commercialized, they could just do it on such a large scale that it just decimated the whale population very quickly. Game fish, and I mean, we're having a major problem with this right now. Lots of the fish you probably eat on a regular basis, I know, like some of the salmons and the tunas, and Chilean sea bass, and all these kinds of very tasty fish. They are being overharvested, though, and so it runs the really high risk of them just going away forever. And then you wouldn't be able to eat them at all anymore. So these are kinds of things we have to worry about. Here's lemurs, little lemurs on the front of our non-majors book. These have been harvested for bushmeat for the market, even though there are so few left. Pollution is going to be the fourth threat to biodiversity. Different chemicals go into the air, go into the water, onto land. And this is an important concept, this biomagnification or biological magnification. So what's happening there is this concentration of pollutants. So PCB is the pollutant we're looking at. And it's actually highly relevant to humans because humans tend to be at the top of this chain here. And so we could get very high levels of pollutants, even though the levels in the at the source are low. So here's the example, the phytoplankton, the kinds of part per million of this PCBs, they have 0.025, so that's pretty low. Phytoplankton are eaten by zooplankton as well as some of the primary consumers that are larger, like smelt. And depending on how much they consume, you can see the parts per million starts bumping up. And then those are consumed by bigger organisms, which then have more of the PCBs in their cells, and then those are consumed by even higher organisms, which then lay eggs, like in this case. So then the herring, in its eggs that it laid, it's going to have really high concentrations of PCBs. So you can see at each level, the amount gets increased because of this biomagnification. And that's what happened with DDT, is that the eagles were at the top of the food chain there, or the food web, and so they got really high levels of DDT, the insecticide, and they couldn't reproduce properly. Eggshells were really fragile, and their offspring weren't surviving, and really because of biomagnification. And we talked in one of my classes about global warming pretty extensively, but just to let you know, I mean, global warming, I like to call it global climate change better, because the basis of it is, yes, that the Earth is warming, and we do know that's definitely true. It's not controversial in the scientific community at all. It's also not controversial whether it's due to human impact, because we can see the numbers are much more rapid. So the kind of change that we've seen over 100 years in temperature typically happens over hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. Or at least tens of thousands. Certainly not 100 years. And the factor that's different is us, you know. And we know very directly kind of relationships between or chemicals that are released into the atmosphere or are in the water or whatever, and their impact on the environment. So I call it global climate change, though, because not everywhere gets hotter. It just changes. So the heating does make ice melt, again, the ice caps, the glaciers. But some places get hotter, some places don't. Precipitation patterns change. I mean, we can start to see the effect of that with the drought. Now, not everything is due to global warming, which some people claim. So I know that some of the big storms recently, some people were attributing to global warming, but the meteorologists have done all the numbers, and they said, no, actually, these are just due to other kinds of events. So you can't blame it for everything, but it is starting to really show up and impact a lot of our kind of seasons and the weather we have and whatnot. So here's the map, and indeed everywhere, except for like very few places here in Antarctica, have gotten warmer. over time. So this would be the warmer, and this is cooler. And you can see really the ice cap, the northern ice cap particularly, is where we're really having a problem. And we can see that in pictures. So this is a picture of a glacier. So this is glacier all over the place. And you can see over time, we have less and less of the glacier itself. It's melted away. You can see that here as well. You've seen this chart before, knowing that the distribution of different chemicals that come from fossil fuel burning, because remember, a fossil fuel is just the remnants of an ancient organism, so it's carbon, hydrogen compounds, right, hydrocarbons that are really high energy, lots of energy in their bonds, which is why it makes such good fuel for us to use. However, when you, just like cellular respiration, when you burn that, you release CO2 into the atmosphere, and it's just at a much higher level than it would be if it were decaying naturally. And so here's a graph. You can see the numbers have increased dramatically in the last, 500 years here. And so we can correlate that with temperature, and we can correlate that with human activity. And we know that they all go together pretty, meshes pretty well. And here's what I mean. So photosynthesis takes away the carbon dioxide, but we're putting more back into the atmosphere faster than the plants and algae and cyanobacteria can take it away. And some of that's due to agriculture, so increased people and other organisms. That's going to do more cellular respiration, which releases CO2. And then burning of the fossil fuels also releases CO2, and that's going to go into the atmosphere as well. Now, is it logistical at this point to just completely get rid of fossil fuels? No, it's not. But just using them more wisely and less of them, as well as supplementing when you can with other types of energy sources, or walking, or riding your bike, or whatever. Sustainable practices of farming and whatnot, that's going to be really where you can decrease those numbers in a logical way that's actually realistic. Okay. So when we talk about this conservation biology idea, so they're studying the changes and trying to figure out how to prevent those changes. So that could be something you're interested in. You can read more about that in the chapter. And so basically you look at things like this, the landscape, you can see the changes of human existence there, and then how's that going to make consequences, and what could you do to either limit that or understand it better. And you go out in the field a lot, so it's a really interactive kind of job there. And those biodiversity hotspots actually are the same places that we saw are the primary photosynthetic sites in the world, the tropical rainforests as well as the coral reefs. They're going to be where you have tons of biodiversity, disproportionately concentrated. Species that are found nowhere else, they're called endemic species. So if they go away, and you can see them here, tropical forests, they don't actually have the ones in the ocean, but those are also present. And when we lose those, not only is it, we lose lots of organisms, which is sad, and, to love the beauty of nature is definitely a good thing, but it's also on the more selfish, if you want to say it that way, level. Lots of drugs come from these places, lots of new foods that are better to culture, lots of organisms with kind of behaviors or materials that we could use and mimic in synthetic ways. And to lose those before we know about those is really unfortunate. So really what we're doing is trying to restore in restoration ecology. And you can read about some of those different ways we're doing that. And it is working, but just slowly. And if more people get on board and kind of live more sustainable lives, we don't have to do this as much. And hopefully this class in biology has allowed you to appreciate the life that's around us on a very small scale to a larger scale, and now to the biosphere. and kind of see how really interesting and intertwined it all is, and pretty, hopefully, inspiring, I guess. And that, if you appreciate that, then you'd want to conserve it, as well as understanding how it does impact humans in the end. And so really the research going into understanding how these changes are happening and why, and then working towards ways of living that are still comfortable but are sustainable with less impact on all the other organisms in the biosphere.